One of the questions I'm regularly asked is, what do you think house prices are going to do over the next 12 months, the next year, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever it is? And people know that I have a good interest in property because I've been buying and selling property since 1986. December 1986, I bought my first property. Since then, I've been buying property, residential, commercial, sites, you name it. There isn't any type of property, I don't believe, that I haven't actually bought, except for a warehouse. However, people also know that I'm a solicitor and I do quite a lot of property transactions, quite a lot of conveyancing in my solicitor's practice. And for that reason, people ask me, what way is the market going to go? Is there any sign of a slowdown, etc., etc.? Occasionally then I have people, clients, and indeed friends and relations who contact me and say that they've heard that there's going to be a crash, or there's going to be a market crash, there's going to be a correction, there's going to be a downturn, etc. What do I think? And again, you have these rumours, these stories being put out by people for whatever reason, misinformation, disinformation, call it what you like, mistaken information, and with no data, with no evidence whatsoever to support it. And my view is the same all of the time. My view is that until supply catches up with demand, then house prices are going to stay firm, very firm in terms of their price, or they're going to increase in price. And that is a basic outcome, a basic function of the most simple economics. When supply does not equal demand, when demand outstrips supply, you're going to have a rise in house prices. You're going to have a rise in any commodity if there is a massive difference or gap or deficit between supply and demand. But to what extent is the demand much greater than supply? When is supply likely to meet demand? When are we likely to see equilibrium? When are we likely to see prices leveling off? And so on. There's a very interesting report in the, having been published there now by the government, by one of the departments, and I'm going to have a look at that now. And it sets out the sort of prognosis for the next 15 years, in fact, and it looks at supply and demand, it looks at the demographics, it looks at the data, looks at the evidence, and it gives a frightening prognosis, quite frankly, if you're looking to buy a property or get on the property ladder, or you're hoping that the guy on the WhatsApp group or Facebook that told you that there was a correction coming, or a downturn was inevitable, or a crash like the Celtic Tiger years is going to happen. I think you'll find this report striking and well worth a look. So let's have a look at that report now. Okay, this report is a Department of Finance report, and it basically says that the housing crisis is going to last another 15 years. And that's not scaremongering by some guy, you know, on Signal, or some guy on a Facebook group. This is the Department of Finance prediction based on the demographics. And the demographics, future demand, future supply, are absolutely key, because the basic tenets of economics, as I say, it all comes down to supply and demand. When supply cannot meet the demand, well, then prices are going to rise. It's as simple as that. The Irish Times deals with this report, has a look at the report. The economics correspondent from the Irish Times, Owen Burke Kennedy, has written a report, or written an article about it, and that's what I'm relying on for this video. But it's basically based on this report from the Department of Finance called Future 40, a Fiscal and Economic Outlook to 2065. So it looks at the next 40 years to 2065. And it says that Ireland's housing crisis is likely to persist for at least another 15 years, according to the Department of Finance. Housing demand is not expected to peak until the early 2030s. So pent-up demand will not be fully eliminated until at least 2040. So you think demand is bad now, housing demand is not expected to peak until the early 2030s. This analysis is contained in that report, Future 40, a fiscal and economic outlook to 2065. That's the Department of Finance's assessment of the economic and fiscal challenges facing the state between now and 2065. That is the next 40 years. The report based its estimate of future housing demand on current demographic trends and the growing preference for smaller households and the pent-up demand that has accumulated in recent years. In the central scenario, housing supply is assumed to reach 60,000 by 2030, a significant acceleration on the 30,300 delivered last year, and then remain at that level until no longer required. So this report is assuming that supply will reach 60,000 a year by 2030, but that's actually a doubling from the figure that we've had in the last year. The report noted that the number of workers in residential construction would need to grow considerably by 50,000, according to one estimate, to meet these targets. The central projection also presumes that 25% of newly built dwellings after 2030 will be built as social homes, with 26% of tenants in the rental market being eligible for social housing supports, including rent supports such as HAP, that's the Housing Assistance Payment, and ROSS, that's the Rental Accommodation Scheme. This would see the overall cost of housing for the Exchequer rise to 2.3% of national income at its peak before falling once demand normalises by 2040. So 2040 is 15 years away. The report noted that the continuous undersupply of housing in recent years had seen average house prices rise by 91% from 2015 to the end of 2024. So that's roughly 10 years, 91% increase in house prices, while open market rents have risen by 78%. This compares with overall price inflation for the same period of 22%. So massive disparity between ordinary inflation and house price inflation. High housing costs pose significant challenges to the Irish economy as they have increased the relative cost of living and are potentially impacting the country's capacity to attract and retain a highly skilled workforce, the Department of Finance's report said. The report examined the long-term impacts of global megatrends as well, such as climate change, digitalisation and population ageing on the economy and the Exchequer. Climate change will reduce national income by more than 2% by 2065, with most damage caused by flooding and sea level rise. The state's ageing population poses a potentially bigger risk to the public finances. There are currently 116 people in the labour force for every 100 not working. By 2065, there will, on current projections, be 98 people in the labour force for every 100 not working. Without corrective measures, this demographic shift could see the state's budget deficit swell to 8% of income, while increasing the country's borrowing requirement to almost 150% of national income. Continued inward migration will be vital to maintain growth in the labour force, the report said. So continued inward migration will be vital to maintain growth in the labour force. So this Department of Finance report seems to fly in the face of what Simon Harris had to say the other day about migration being too high. But of course, Simon Harris was conflating migration and asylum seeking and people seeking asylum. If net migration were zero, the labour force would start to contract by 2035 with major repercussions for the economy. So that's if net migration were zero. In other words, if we weren't taking anybody into the country. Total voted expenditure, a proxy for the size of the state, is projected to increase from 33% of national income in 2025 to 39% by 2065, at which point ageing-related expenditure, that's the likes of healthcare, long-term care and pensions, will account for 46% of all voted expenditure, the report said. The prediction for the Republic's population, which was contained in a chapter published last month, ranges between 5.9 million and 7.9 million, depending on the assumed net migration and fertility rates. But the bottom line is, and the takeaway from this report from the Department of Finance, is that the housing crisis, the difficulty for people getting on the property ladder, is going to continue for at least 15 more years. And it will be 15 years before there is any equilibrium between supply and demand. In other words, the supply of housing and demand for housing, and that's based on the Department of Finance's own report and based on the demographics and the trends and growth and migration and so on and so forth. So what are house prices going to do? You can make up your own mind, but you don't need to be a genius to figure out, and you don't have to know a whole lot about economics to figure out that if supply doesn't meet demand, well then prices are going to rise. It's as simple as that. Hope you liked the video. If you do, I'd appreciate if you hit the thumbs up button down below. Thanks a lot.